Welcome back to My Best Friend's an Engineer. I'm Libby.
And I'm Lexi.
And on today's episode, we spoke with Kimberly, who is a PhD candidate. She is currently doing her research around pathology, which is the study of disease. And she specifically is doing a lot of experiments on brains and how a specific protein affects certain diseases. So I know nothing about brains. This was such an interesting episode. Highly recommend you guys continue to listen. But before we get into it, let's do our Tea of the Week segment. Lexi, how has your week been?
My week has been pretty good. So it's been rainy, which I love this weather, the fall weather.
Me too.
I love that it's getting colder. So I am just all around happy. But the one thing I don't like is that it's getting dark earlier. But
yeah,
that's the only tea I have. The weather is acting like it should. But other than that,
we're recording at it's almost 7:00 and it's already almost pitch black outside.
I know, I'm looking at the sunset slowly but surely, but it's kind of cute. I was like, that's a nice little background. But it's funny because when we had our book club, I didn't have any lights on in my room, so you could slowly see me getting darker. And then it was just a white little circle from the light of the laptop screen just staring at everyone talking about our book. But yeah, so other than that, it has been a good week. I've been enjoying myself with this weather. But how about you? How has your week been?
It's been good. I actually just got a crown on my tooth that I got a root canal on. So
why did I think Fortnite? Oh my god,
Fortnite.
You play Fortnite? I was like, what's your gamer tag?
Hit me up, we can play together.
Did I ever tell you that Joey and I play Fortnite together?
Oh my god, you, me, Brett, and Joey should have a Fortnite date sometime.
It's so funny because I'm not good at all, and he's just because I have my sister's Xbox, so I just go on it, and it's just so funny because he's trying to strategize, and I'm just running around trying to look at things, and he's like, stop it. But yeah, so I'm a gamer girl. Honestly, I don't really game that much. Only when his friends can't play. He's like, okay, can you get on? But I guess, okay, that's my tea of the week.
That's hilarious. That's pretty much my tea. I got a crown. So I accidentally forgot to go to the dentist for 3 years in college. And so a couple, probably 6 months ago, I decided to go to the dentist. And they're like, oh, by the way, one of your tooth, it's dead. Actually, it's completely dead. This is kind of gross. All the cells in my tooth were dead. And so they were like, you're not really going to feel anything when we do this root canal because there's nothing really in there for you to feel anyway. So they I had an appointment and they drilled it out, and that was 6 months ago. And then they're like, we're going to let it be to see if anything happens before we do the crown. So today they made a fake little cap and it's in my mouth right now and it's just hanging out. And then, yeah, so that's what I did today. Before we recorded, I was really nervous that my face was going to be they were going to have to numb me and my face was going to be frozen and I was going to have to ask you to ask all the questions because I wasn't going to be able to talk.
That's so funny. Well, you look great.
Thank you.
You look not like a chipmunk.
I think with that, we can probably go to reading some of the reviews that we've received recently on the podcast.
Yeah, we wanted to change it up a little bit. We're not going to do any tea of the week. We're let's go back to the reviews. So we'll do a little switch up here. So Avril said, 5 stars for a podcast that deserves so much more. When I tell you I couldn't be happier I've come across this podcast, I mean it. Motivational and educational, it's nice to feel like you aren't alone. Empowering to my spirit, I recommend constantly to people I know. Thank you.
That's
Love
amazing.
That. These always make me smile.
I know. It's so humbling. Well, Izzy said, Lexi and Libby have provided so much insight into the real engineering world that people don't really talk about. This podcast has been so helpful for my full-time engineering role. Can't wait to keep seeing this podcast grow. Keep it up. Thank you guys so much for such kind reviews. If you guys like this podcast, it really, really helps us out when you leave a written review on Apple Podcasts. So whether you're listening on Apple or Spotify, if you could leave a rating and review, take a screenshot of it, send it into our Google form that will put you in a giveaway drawing for a $100 Visa gift card. But yeah, like we said, we love reading them. It really helps out the podcast, and it's a great way for you guys to support us without having to do anything. All you have to do is leave a little review, and it's really not that hard. So go leave a review if you're listening right now.
Yes, and you can do that by going to the link in our Instagram bio. We have a form where you can submit any reviews. And for our other housekeeping, go to our Instagram. On our bio, we have links to everything.
In addition to leaving a review, you guys know you got to check out our compensation negotiation workshop. This is going to be taking place on October 18th, 2022. Last week's guests were Jill and Sophie, and they are the women from the company The Thoughtful Co. who are going to be presenting this workshop to you guys if you choose to sign up. So that link is also going to be down below in the show notes, and then it's also linked in our Instagram bio. We have limited spots available. Make sure you're signing up for that. It's going to be all about how to negotiate your salary.
Let's get into it.
Hello, Kimberly, and welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on, my best friend's an engineer today. Can you give our listeners who may not know you a brief intro of who you are, what you're studying, and what you're passionate about?
Yes, so thank you so much for having me. My name is Kimberly Fiock. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Iowa. I study experimental pathology, which is just a very fancy way to say that I study diseases. And my lab is specifically interested in neuropathology, or diseases that affect the brain. So my work is trying to understand basically why one protein can cause multiple different types of diseases that have different symptoms and might respond to different types of treatment. And one of the things that I'm really focused on is why this one protein affects different types of cells. So your brain has lots of different types of cells in it. Some are important for communicating, like neurons. Others, like astrocytes, are important for helping other cells to stay alive and keep your brain happy and keep things out of the brain that aren't supposed to be there. And so the protein that we study called tau affects these cells differently in different diseases. So basically, I'm trying to figure out why that is, and hopefully we can develop therapeutics that will be specific for these different cell types in different diseases.
Amazing. Can you give a little overview about what your undergrad looks like, and kind of what year you are in your PhD program?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what made you, want to pursue a PhD?
Yeah, that's a great question. I ask myself that question like every day, basically. So I did my undergrad degree in neuroscience and psychology. Originally, I wanted to be a chemist. So I loved my high school chemistry class, and so I wanted to do drug development, pharmacology. So I applied to every school but one as a chemistry major, and the school I ended up going to, I actually applied as a neuroscience major. And I literally knew nothing about the brain. I figured it was cool. If they had a whole major for it, it had to be interesting enough. So I applied. I got into a research internship that first summer before I started college, which kind of set me on the path to be really interested in neuroscience research specifically. I always knew I wanted to be a scientist, but didn't necessarily know what that meant or what that would become for me. So that was my first real experience being a scientist. And I worked in chronic pain research, which I thought was pretty cool, but I worked with animals and I didn't love that. So the next year I did an internship in a neuropathology lab, and I worked with real human brain tissue for the first time. And that pretty much changed my life. That was the first time I held a human brain. It was the first time I helped with an autopsy. I learned that we could see diseases under a microscope, and I realized that that was what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So after that experience, I decided to pursue grad school because I was really interested in working in a brain bank long term. So if you're not familiar, brain banks are essentially donated tissue. So when an individual passes away, they can donate their brain to science, and we keep all of those brains in what we call a brain bank so that researchers like ourselves and at other institutions can use that tissue to advance their work. And so I realized after that undergrad experience that that's really what I wanted to do, and that required having a graduate degree. I struggled a lot in undergrad with my mental health. I have bipolar disorder, and that was really, really hard. I was diagnosed as a freshman. And so I wasn't sure right away that a PhD was going to be obtainable for me. So I opted to do a master's degree, which was the best decision I ever made. I don't regret it one bit. I learned how to be a scientist for the first time, truly learned, and I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about grad school, and then after 2 years of my master's degree, I decided that I could, in fact, do a PhD and stayed on in my lab to pursue a PhD. And now I'm technically starting my third year of my PhD, but since I did my master's degree, it's technically like the beginning of my 5th academic year of grad school. So somewhere near the end.
Wow, that is incredible. I don't know how you handle brains. I would be kind of squeamish, I feel like. But it sounds like, so is pathology, like starting from the basics, pathology for dummies, is pathology essentially the study of the brain, or are there other things like encompassed under pathology?
Yeah, so pathology is actually the study of disease, and that encompasses
Okay.
all different types of diseases. So, immunology, for example, so the immune system, that's part of pathology. If you have cancer, that's also part of pathology. And then neuropathology specifically is brain diseases. But pretty much any disease you can think of is housed under pathology. It's a very broad field.
Going back to Libby's comment about being squeamish, working with, human brains, I just want to know, what do you experience, or maybe the first time you worked with a human brain? What were the emotions you experienced, the whole thought process? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I actually thought I would be really squeamish. I'm one of those people that, like, in a scary movie, when there's like a bloody scene, I freak out. But in real life, I think it's so different. It's such a different experience that it really didn't bother me. The first time I held a human brain, I can't even describe the feeling. It's just a feeling of awe that you're holding someone's entire life in your hands. So I'm very. It was just a very like awe-inspiring moment, and I appreciated that experience so much. And then the first time I did an autopsy was kind of a moment when I realized, like, there's so much good we can do in the world when we're alive, but then after we die, there's even more good that we can do. And that was kind of like a very thankful experience that I could be there with someone for their final good deed of the world. I think that's kind of the way I look at it. And now every opportunity I have since then, I kind of say a little bit of a thank you to the donor, because this is pretty much the most selfless act that you can do, which is donate your body, both as an organ donor for living recipients and also to science to advance our medical knowledge.
Wow, that sounds like almost like a really poetic and at maybe some level spiritual experience. I feel like those emotions that you described with holding someone's brain.
Yeah, it really is. It's kind of one of those things. Like I said, it's hard to describe until you've done it yourself. But I think it's just it makes you appreciate everything that a person has been through. You're holding it all in your hands, and I think that in a way it makes you have a little bit more kindness for people. We're
Mhm.
all going to be that brain someday. Maybe not donated, but the point is we're all going to pass away someday, and we're all going to be that brain someday that has lived its whole life and is now there. So I think it just makes you have a little bit more kindness and appreciation for other people.
Yeah, that is really amazing and really cool that you're able to kind of explore that side with the sciences that you're studying. But to get back into the sciences, so you mentioned that the tau protein is, I think you mentioned that's what you're studying, or the tau protein can change the way diseases are. Can you kind of elaborate a little bit on that? And are there specific diseases that you are currently studying?
Yeah, absolutely. So the tau protein is just a normal protein that everybody has in their brain. It's really important to provide stability to neurons. So neurons are kind of floppy, and we want them to be stable. So I was explaining it to my mom the other day. It's kind of like support beams. Tau is essentially like the support beams that keep a neuron standing and able to communicate with other proteins. And in disease, basically, tau stops supporting the cell gets kind of floppy and wonky. Tau builds up inside the cell, and then the cell no longer works and it dies. And the more that happens, the more symptoms you have, like cognitive decline. So people have memory problems, they have like executive functioning problems. They can also have changes to personality depending on where the tau protein builds up in their brain. So this is most commonly seen in Alzheimer's disease. I think that's the one most people are familiar with tau. But there's a lesser known group of diseases called frontotemporal dementias. And that's what I talked about earlier with astrocytes having tau protein. That's frontotemporal dementias, whereas Alzheimer's disease is just in neurons. So my project is essentially trying to understand why, if you have the same protein, you can have two very different diseases with very different cells that are affected in them.
Is this going off of a project that you started in your master's program, or can you talk about how you started getting into focusing on the tau protein? Was it kind of the lab that you were applying for your program with? They were working on this project initially, or did you kind of present it?
Yeah, so it's actually a bit different than when I worked on my master's degree. So when I joined my master's program, the PI or principal investigator who I work under was the only person in my department who did neuroscience research. And since I had a neuroscience background, I was like, okay, well, I'm working for you now, which actually worked out really wonderfully because he's the most amazing boss I've ever had. He's wonderful and very supportive. And he was interested in tau, but in fetal development. So the role of tau basically in normal function of cells, and then how that basically goes awry or what makes it different so that when you're older, you develop a disease, but you don't develop that same problem when you're a fetus. And so my master's project was really focused on development and looking at fetal brain and what tau does in a normal context. And then when I graduated and stayed on in my lab, my PI was like, okay, time for a new project. What do you want to do? What are you interested in? And I was really interested in why different cell types are affected in these diseases. And so I kind of took that on to be the new project and focus. I still do some developmental stuff, but I kind of shifted to be more focused on disease than development.
That's really cool that your PI kind of like posed that question to you in the first place. I don't know. I'm not too familiar with research labs and stuff like that. I don't know like the process that you have to go through to like get projects approved or anything like that. But I just feel like that's something that I haven't heard of with very many people who are doing research.
Yeah, it's pretty rare. Most people come into a lab with a PI who has a project in mind for them when they join. I was really lucky because I was actually my PI's first graduate student. So there was pretty much a blank slate and we could work on anything. And then as we worked together longer and we started just chatting about things that questions we had about, the world and our field and how it worked, from those conversations that emerged a project that I had a passion for. And he was like, you need a PhD project. If this is your passion, like go for it. That's, that'll help you finish, in a reasonable time if you're passionate about it. So I was very lucky to have a small lab and a new PI who basically gave me free range to pick something that I really felt strongly about.
Speaking of your research and like everything that you're doing with your PhD program, I wanted to ask you because I love talking to other women in STEM. I feel like we're all like problem solvers, but me coming from the mechanical engineering background, like I am really not too familiar with neuroscience at all. So for our listeners, I'm really interested to know what are some of the biggest challenges or some of the heavy hitter problems that you have to solve or work through while you're doing your research?
Yeah, I think the fundamental problem is that the brain is so complex and that every time we know a little bit about it, there's that much more that we just don't know. And it's kind of funny. People have said this to me before where it's weird to think about the fact that we use our brain to answer questions about the brain. And then it kind of is in this loop. Every time you learn something new using your brain, then there's one more thing you don't know about your own brain. So I think that's one of the biggest fundamental issues in neuroscience. It's just that there's so much we don't know. I think another issue is that these diseases, particularly Alzheimer's disease, are so prevalent and people are so deeply affected that it's very hard not to feel emotional about your work sometimes. Personally, my grandma has Parkinson's disease and has started developing dementia symptoms. And so seeing that progress and then learning more about how that happens pathologically and the mechanisms behind that has been, a good and a bad thing. It's been good because I understand better, but also then I know more than someone else does, and it makes it kind of harder to watch sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think fundamentally just being so emotionally invested in a lot of the things that we study can be very draining. Your work can be very draining. I think those are kind of the biggest issues in neuroscience.
You mentioned earlier, and I'm so sorry to hear that your grandmother has Parkinson's. I wanted to ask, like, is that something that inspired your passion or desire to pursue this research? Or did you have any sort of a role model who you looked up to in this sort of science space that inspired you to continue with this research opportunity?
That's a great question. So, my grandma actually wasn't diagnosed until after I was kind of already on this path. But when I was a kid, my mom actually was diagnosed with breast cancer. And although I don't do cancer research, I think that really sparked my interest in like, why do some people get sick? Like, that was a fundamental question, along with myself just being very ill as a child. I wanted to know, why do some people get sick and others don't? There's got to be some fundamental reason. And so that always really kind of stuck in my mind that I was interested in figuring that out. And then as I developed, I had a wonderful high school chemistry teacher who really inspired me to continue pursuing science. I had some great role models at the neuropathology lab that I worked in when I was in undergrad that showed me, hey, you don't have to go to med school to be interested in pathology. You can get a PhD and do pathology research and still be very valuable in the field. So that kind of started long before my grandma, but I'm certainly inspired to continue doing the work to hopefully someday help other people that are suffering not just from Parkinson's, but all neurodegenerative diseases.
So that actually kind of leads into another question I wanted to ask on where you see yourself once your PhD program is completed. What are your thoughts for the future?
That's a great question. You know, if you had asked me that question maybe a year or so ago, it would be very clear. Now I have had a lot of wonderful experiences in my PhD that have made me less clear on what I want to do long term. I love brain banking and I'm very passionate about doing that and educating my community on the importance of brain donation and brain research. I also love working at the bench. Being a scientist is what I've always wanted to be. So I definitely want to continue that. But with doing my Instagram, I've realized that I really do love science communication and sharing about my field with people. And so my career goal long term is really to find a way to do all of those things and sleep and, you know, have a family and a balanced life. But I really want to incorporate a lot of those different aspects because each one of them holds a very different place in my heart.
Say there's somebody who is listening to this episode who may be going through their undergrad right now, or hearing your words is inspiring them to look toward this for a career path. What are some actionable steps or some advice that you could give them that they could be doing right now to either look into programs or look into different paths they want to take, whatever it may be? What is some of that initial advice that you could give somebody who's listening?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. I think the first thing would be just talking to people in the field. Like I mentioned earlier, pathology is very broad, and the things that somebody who works in immunology does is going to be very different than someone who works in neuropathology or cardiac pathology. So I think just talking to different people and seeing kind of what interests you, what kind of daily things interest you is a great first step. Getting research exposure or research experience is always a great first step. Do you actually like working in a research lab? Do you like doing hands-on experiments? Or would you rather do something that's more, you know, computer-based, computational? That's like a really good way to decide, do I want to pursue grad school, which is 5 or 6 years of doing that same thing, and then eventually, you know, potentially a long-term career. Another big thing is just taking time to look online and read, you know, scientific papers are scary and they're hard if you're not familiar with it, but just see if you can find summaries or even review papers that break down topics and, you know, figure out what diseases are you interested in? Are you interested in learning more about cancer or neurodegenerative disease or, you know, something that's an autoimmune disorder? Like reading about what's there, you know, what's available online and figuring out what interests you. I think the biggest thing that I struggled with, I guess, in undergrad was like figuring out what I was passionate about. I was passionate about everything. And so narrowing that down, I think figuring out what you're passionate about and what drives you, that's going to make grad school much more bearable. That's going to make your long-term career much more bearable if it's something you truly enjoy and are curious to learn more about. If you're trying to force yourself to learn about something, it's going to be a very long and painful process. So finding things that you truly want to know more about will really help you figure out, like, what do I want to do long term?
I really like your comment about, getting that research experience in undergrad, because I attest to that. I agree. You don't know if you like something until you actually do it. You can read all about it, you can talk to people, but until you're the one doing it, you never really get a full picture. But you touched on earlier about how you had an internship or a research experience the summer going into your freshman year, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you could touch on that a little bit. I think that is very impressive. You have, you're coming in with no experience. Can you talk a little bit more about how you were able to get that opportunity?
Yeah, so I was really lucky. The institution I went to for undergrad actually had a summer research opportunity for freshmen. And it was a program that we applied to. So most of us had no experience at all. I certainly didn't. So I think a lot of it was just based on your passion and what you really wanted to learn about and what you were excited about. So I was very fortunate that they had that, and I was selected to participate in the first year. That's really rare. I know there's not a lot of opportunities for high school students out there, so I feel for high school students. There is a list online, and I can definitely send it to y'all to link with this episode, of some high school opportunities that I know of in the biomedical field or the biomedical space, that would be a great place to start. But I just happened to get pretty lucky.
Awesome. Yeah, that'd be great. We'll definitely put in the notes.
Yeah, I didn't participate in any of those as a high school student, but the undergraduate opportunities, that's where I found out about the neuropathology internship that I did my sophomore year of college. So they have some really, really great opportunities. The neuroscience one is very comprehensive, pretty much every neuroscience undergraduate internship opportunity that's available. So it's a really great resource.
Yeah, if you're able to share that, we would love to put that in the show notes below and in the link in our bio for anybody who is interested. I wanted to kind of pivot the conversation a little bit right now and revisit something that you talked about at the very beginning of the episode when you introduced yourself is your mental health. So I wanted to know, do you have any recommendations for somebody who may be listening who is either currently going through a master's or a PhD program or thinking about it, who also has mental health that they're considering in their day-to-day lives? Like, what are some of your recommendations for ways that you either cope or like keep yourself organized or like still keep your research top of mind when you also have your mental health to work with?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is definitely like an ongoing process, and I've been in grad school 4 years and I'm still trying to figure it out. So my first piece of advice is if you don't have it figured out, like that's okay. It's going to take time and it's going to change. The longer you're in grad school, the more different stressors that you experience, and that really changes your coping strategies. So the things that I used to cope when I first started grad school are not the things that I use now, and that's okay. Biggest thing is very much a support system. So I met my husband while I was in grad school, and before that, it was pretty miserable because I moved across the country and knew no one. And making grad school friends is very difficult. And so I was really lucky. I met him pretty early on, and he became a really great support system. Also, I'm very, very fortunate that my PI or my boss, my principal investigator, is so supportive. I talk to him a lot about my mental health and what I'm going through, and he's very much he's a great listener, and also he's very much like, okay, if you're overwhelmed or this isn't working for you, what can we do differently? So I don't feel alone, which I think is really, really important. It's very easy to feel alone when you're going through something with your mental health, especially for me with having bipolar disorder. Sometimes I'm up, sometimes I'm down, and that very much changes my productivity in the lab or what I'm excited or passionate about. And so he's very great with working with me with saying like, okay, if this is how you're feeling right now, what can we do differently to make sure that like you're still on track, or like what can I take off of your plate so you're not feeling overwhelmed? So definitely a support system. The other big thing, which I know is not unfortunately available to everyone, but therapy was really, really life-changing for me in grad school. I came into grad school with limited coping skills, and so through therapy, I learned a lot about what can I do differently, how can I think about things differently, like what kind of environments can I put myself in where I know I'm going to thrive and succeed. And a lot of that just came through therapy. And I wish it was a more widely available resource. I know a lot of grad students struggle with that. If you can't get into therapy, I think the biggest thing is just journaling. It sounds kind of silly, but for someone with bipolar disorder, writing down my moods and like what triggered that is really important for me so that I know what things to avoid. So if a situation is really stressful and I'm feeling a certain type of way and I write it down, and then I can kind of go back and look through it and be like, oh, okay, like during a manic episode, these things really bothered me. Next time I'm feeling this way, I'm going to avoid these things, or I'm going to try really hard to avoid these things, or I'm going to do something differently to make sure those situations don't happen because I know I don't handle them well. And same way with the depressive episode. And that just comes from years of living with it and learning what things do and don't work for me. So definitely writing things down so that you can check back in with yourself and be like, hey, that situation was really hard. I wasn't feeling good mentally. What about that situation bothered me? And can I avoid that in the future, or can I do something differently in the future?
Going off of your support system, and you mentioned quite a bit about your supportive PI, which is great. I know that a professor, especially just in an academic setting, it can be a game changer, huge game changer on just that interaction. But for the people who are maybe going through a grad program that don't have that supportive relationship with a PI, I am not too familiar with PhD programs, but I'm just curious if there is ever a situation where someone is going through a program and they're not, working very cohesively with a PI, do they have the opportunity to switch, or how would that process go? And do you have any advice for someone kind of experiencing that?
Yeah, so a lot of it depends on the program itself. So there definitely are options if you and your PI are very much at odds and you're not going to be successful. There are instances where people will switch. The earlier in a program you do that, obviously the better, because the further along you are, the harder it gets. You're more invested in a project or in a particular lab. But there are a lot of steps that you could take before you get to that point. So the biggest one, or the first one, is talking to your program director. So when you join a program, you have a program director who oversees all of the students in that program. And each student is in their own lab, or maybe in shared lab, but is in their own lab with a PI. And so the program director is really responsible for helping you kind of work through problems if you do have them, or making sure that you know the resources that you need if there is a problem. So that would definitely be the first step. The second step, most universities have what's called an office of the omnibuds person, which is essentially like an unbiased, neutral person that you can go and have like share grievances about. So this is not, if you're uncomfortable going to your superior or somebody who's above them, maybe that's a great person to talk to who's unbiased, and you can present all the information and they can give you advice on kind of what to do or what your university like mandated resources would be. Most universities should have one of those. And then, of course, some people don't have a horrible relationship with their PI, but they're just not the most supportive, or they don't have the right type of mentorship style for them, and they choose to stay in their lab because their research works out, but their PI is not a great mentor, and that's okay too. In those instances, I really suggest finding someone else in your department or at your university that aligns with your values. So your PI can be really great at managing your research, but not very helpful in networking or teaching you about presentations or something like that. So finding someone else in your department that you really connect with, or even at your university, I think is a great resource to have a different perspective, but not necessarily have to change labs.
I had never thought about that before talking, if you are in that situation with a PI, because I feel like in undergrad, I'm familiar with undergrad research. And in undergrad, you can kind of leave a project, go to a different lab. I think it's a bit easier. But, that PhD program, you kind of maybe feel a little bit suffocated or locked in with a certain project. So I'm glad we could touch on that.
So I wanted to ask, looking towards the future, what does your PhD program look like to completion? So are there certain requirements that you're in the process of fulfilling? Are there any large papers or presentations or public speaking that you have to give? And what is the timeline for you to finish your PhD?
Yeah, so there are a couple milestones. My PhD program is a little bit unique. So my program is what we call direct admit, which means I started my PhD program in a specific lab, knowing, kind of what I was going to do. So my timeline is a little bit different. So I'll talk more about like a traditional timeline, since that's what most people will have. So most people will join a program that's not direct admit, and what they'll first do is they'll do rotations. So they'll go to other labs or labs in their department. Usually they're about 10 weeks, and you'll basically learn about what the lab does, what techniques they do, what projects are available. And that gives you a sense of, is this a good fit for me? Do I like the environment? Do I like the work? Do I like the PI? All of those things. And then once you're done with those rotations, you'll pick a lab, and that will become your thesis lab. That's where you'll essentially do all of your PhD work. And then that takes about a year to 2 years almost. And during that time, that's usually when you do your classes. And then at the end of that, you are done with classes and you go through what's called your comprehensive exam. So essentially, this looks different for different programs, but essentially it's a test to make sure that you've learned what you are supposed to in the first 2 years of your PhD, and that your program is confident that you're going to be successful in a PhD program. So what happens is you assemble what's called a committee, and that's just a group of different professors in either your department or in departments on campus that have some type of expertise that's relevant to your project. And they get together, and depending on what the format is, you present something to them and they decide whether or not you pass. So for my program, we have to write a proposal on a topic that's not our research. So that's called off topic. So mine, I just went through mine a couple months ago. It was very stressful. My project, or my proposal I wrote about, was for stroke. And so I wrote about doing some stroke research, and I won't get into the details because it's not really important, but basically I gave them this 7-page grant proposal about stroke research, and then I gave a short presentation, and then they asked me questions for 2 hours about the proposal and about stroke in general and just general neuroscience questions and things like that. And then at the end, I left the room and they debated, and I came back in and they told me I passed, and it was the most stressful and exhilarating moment of my life. I cried in my PI's office for like an hour afterwards because it was just like so emotionally overwhelming. So a lot of people will have a comprehensive exam. Not all programs do, but most do. And some of those are written tests. Sometimes they're like mine, where it's a grant proposal. It's just kind of program dependent. But that's kind of the first big milestone. After that, usually you're done with classes, and you, in most cases, don't have anything until you're ready to do your thesis defense. So in my program, we just do committee meetings. So again, you meet with those people that you've assembled. You tell them what you're doing in your project. They give feedback or advice on things that they do or don't think that are going to work. And then at the end, when they deem you're ready, you write your thesis, which is usually a 100-page or so document that describes all of your research that you've done over the last, usually it's about 5 to 6 years. You send it to them, and then when they give it the okay, you do an oral defense. So you give a presentation about it, and then you do a private defense where they ask you questions about it. Usually that one's shorter. Usually that's only about an hour, but again, it depends. And then at the end, they tell you whether or not you have successfully defended. And if you do, you are now officially a doctor. So that whole thing from start to finish takes roughly 5 to 6 years. I got a jump start with my master's degree, so I'm hoping to finish mine in about 4.5 total years of grad school. It'll only be about 2.5 years in my actual PhD, but most people take about 5 to 6 years. And it's a lot. It's a lot.
Wow.
It's hopefully worth it. I can't tell you it's worth it for sure yet because I'm not there yet, but I hope it's worth it.
You seem so passionate about it. I already feel like it will be worth it. So
Yeah,
not answering for you, but I'm getting a vibe.
Yes, I think it will be. My master's degree was wonderful, but I didn't get to dive as deeply as I would have wanted to in the topic because a master's degree is only about 2 to 3 years. And so a PhD is great because it's more time, but also it's more time. And working on the same project for 5 or 6 years is exhausting. I forgot to mention, so some programs do have requirements for things that you have to get done before you're eligible to defend. So in my program, you have to publish at least 2 papers. And so that will change your timeline depending on how long it takes you to publish papers to get the approval to graduate. But that's just my program. Not every program requires that. Another program that I know at my school requires what's called a prospectus, which is essentially a mini thesis document that tells them what you're thinking you're going to do for your thesis. My program doesn't have that. So not all programs are the same. Not all programs are created equal, but the bare bones are usually the same, where you have rotations, your comprehensive exam, and then your thesis defense at the end.
Wow, I didn't even know that there was so much that went into getting a PhD. I'm like mind blown over here.
I was going to say the same thing. I'm like, I have friends who are going through the process, but we've never, talked about it so in depth. So props to them. Props to everyone doing a PhD.
Yes, it's kind of funny. So my husband, he's also an engineer, but he did not go to grad school. And so he is being dragged along with me through grad school, learning about what it's like getting a master's degree and then a PhD and stuff. And I don't think he'll ever go get a PhD, I think, after living through my PhD with me. I think that's enough for him.
Well, Kimberly, this was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing with us all about pathology and getting your PhD. But stuttering over here. But before we close out, we like to ask all of our guests this one question, and that is, knowing what you know now, what is one piece of advice that you could give your younger self?
Oh, gosh. I would say when people tell you not to rush, don't listen to them. And I know that sounds like wrong and counterintuitive, but everybody always told me in my life, like, slow down, like do this, do that, like slow down, you'll get to that end goal someday. But like, that's not me. And like, I enjoy like working towards that next goal. And so I think that one piece of advice I would just tell myself, like, don't listen to other people when they try to tell you what your timeline should be. Do your timeline at your own pace and what works for you, because everybody's timeline is going to be different. And it's going to be very detrimental and very harmful if you try to compare yourself to everyone else. So just like, do you. If you want to go quick through everything, go quick through everything. If you want to take the long scenic route, do that too. There's no right answer to the timeline or the path that looks best for you.
Well, Kimberly, would you be able to share where can our listeners find you on social media if they listen to this episode and they really enjoyed hearing what you have to say? Where can they follow you?
Yeah, so the place I'm most active is on Instagram, and my handle is at the path PhD. So path like pathology PhD. I have the same handle on Twitter and also on TikTok, but I have the best content on Instagram, so definitely check out there.
That was amazing. I loved hearing more about the PhD programs in general and just learning all about that side of STEM.
Yeah, I really hope that if you're listening to this episode, you got some great actionable advice. I feel like Kimberly gave so many pieces of nuggets of information that you could like take and implement into your life right after listening to this episode. But I didn't even realize like all the effort that goes into a PhD. Like I knew it was hard. I knew like there was a lot that you have to do, but like listening to her list out all of the things you have to do, I was sitting over here like, oh my God, girl, that is so much work.
I know. I'm so happy we were able to take some time and talk to her because she seems like such a busy person. So I'm just so grateful. After hearing her schedule, I'm like, oh my gosh, thank you.
I know. Well, I think with that, we can probably wrap up another great episode of My Best Friend's an Engineer. Make sure you guys are leaving a rating and review on this podcast, especially if you like this episode. Take a screenshot of it, upload it to your social media, or text the link to this episode to one of your friends who may be thinking about doing a PhD program.
Yes, and you can do all of that at My Best Friend's an Engineer on Instagram and TikTok.
And make sure you guys check out the link in our bio below for our compensation negotiation workshop that will be presented by the company The Thoughtful Co. It's going to be an hour-long workshop with questions at the end, so you can ask all your questions that you have on how to negotiate, talking about the biases that women face with negotiation, the background or behind the scenes that a company has when they're going through a negotiation, and then actionable things that you can do to better negotiate your compensation.
Yes, and if they want to tell you all about their PhD program, Libby, where can they find you?
Yes, if you guys want to follow me on social media, I am found at Libby Beyond the Label on Instagram and TikTok. And then Lexi, where can they find you on social media?
You can find me at Engineer Lexi on Instagram and TikTok. Alrighty, I'm Lexi.
And I'm Libby.
And thanks for listening
to My Best Friends,
an Engineer.